What's in store for Jewish students as they head back to college for the start of the fall semester? Have President Donald Trump's efforts to punish schools like Harvard and Columbia, who tolerated and encouraged a surge of antisemitism driven largely by pro-Hamas mobs, been enough to make academia safe for Jewish kids? Or is the rising tide of Jew hatred sweeping across the globe, fueled by blood libels mainstreamed by the media, creating a situation where the encampments and the hostile environments for Jews in academia are going to be just as bad, if not worse, in the coming year? Is the war that Trump is fighting against the imposition of the woke DEI catechism being won, or are the progressives digging in and likely to survive his efforts to defeat him? Next, on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into the fight against woke antisemitism and whether the administration's efforts to rescue the education system from the anti-Western and anti-Semitic left can succeed. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with law professor and anti-woke crusader William Jacobson of the Legal Insurrection Foundation. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. President Donald Trump's campaign to punish schools that tolerated and encouraged anti-Semitism is about to be put to the test. The question is not just whether Harvard University will follow in Columbia's footsteps and sign a deal that will result in them paying a massive fine for their misconduct and putting measures in place to ensure that the reign of woke bureaucrats and ideology is over, and whether that will set off a cascade of other schools doing the same. It's whether the federal efforts to hold college and university administrations accountable will be enough to deter another surge of Jew hatred fueled by the mainstreaming of blood libels about Israel committing genocide and deliberately starving Palestinians by so much of the corporate liberal media. Rather than the vituperation and lies about Israeli efforts to defeat Hamas in the post-October 7th war dying down after nearly 2 years, the opposite has happened. The pro-Hamas propaganda machine and their enablers in the legacy press have stepped up their efforts to demonize the Jewish state by mimicking the falsehoods emanating from Hamas. So it is more than likely that this will result in a renewed effort by the same anti-Semitic organizations and their left-wing and foreign funders to create more encampments and demonstrations by mobs chanting for Israel's destruction and Jewish genocide. So how will schools react to the growing demonization of Israel, and will the pressure from Washington be enough to keep Jewish students safe? To discuss all this, we're pleased to have back with us today a man who has done as much as anyone to raise awareness of the destructive forces on American college campuses and the fight to defend Western principles that are under siege there. William A. Jacobson is a clinical professor of law and director of the Security Law Clinic at Cornell Law School, where he has taught since 2007. In 2008, he founded the Legal Insurrection website. In 2019, he launched the Legal Insurrection Foundation, a nonprofit research and investigative group focused on promoting free speech and open dialogue, capitalism and free enterprise, and in understanding the intersectional left. In 2021, he created criticalrace.org, a website that catalogs critical race training in higher education, medical schools, military academies, and elite private schools through a series of interactive maps. And in 2023, he launched equalprotect.org, the Equal Protection Project, which takes legal actions to fight racial and other discrimination done in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. William Jacobson, welcome back to Think Twice.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, Bill, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about what we can expect with the start of a new school year. Two immovable forces seem about to collide: the enormous pressure being put on academic institutions by the Trump administration to cease their enabling of anti-Semitism, something that is largely driven by their embrace, on part of the schools, of the woke DEI catechism, with the threats of losing federal funding by Trump. That's coming up against the likelihood that the blood libels about Israel committing genocide and deliberately starving Palestinians that have become conventional wisdom in the mainstream media. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, for a while there in the spring, it looked like, the schools were in retreat, but there's got to be more pressure, coming from the left and from the anti-Israel left on campuses to start it all over again.
Yeah, well, what I'm seeing is I think it's going to be a very hot fall. I think last year in the spring, a lot of these student groups and outside activists, and we should make clear, a lot of what's happening on the campuses are outside activists as well, were a little bit in retreat, a little bit not sure what to do. I know at Cornell, the fact that some students got suspended had a huge impact in tamping down on the aggressiveness of it, particularly one where they disrupted a career event and forced it to almost shut down. And many students were suspended. I think a couple of them had minimal criminal charges for pushing past the police. But that seemed to be the exception. It seemed like things were calming down. What I'm gathering from what I'm seeing is that it's going to come back with a fury. It's going to come back with more aggressiveness. I read the other day that one of the Student for Justice in Palestine groups, I forget if it was one of the DC universities or in North Carolina, has now announced it's disassociating itself from the university because that way they can't be disciplined if they're not part of the university. So they're getting much more aggressive. I see the chatter at Cornell, and they don't hide it. This isn't like secret chat boards. It's on Instagram and other places. They are gearing up for a new level of aggression. But as you mentioned, that creates a problem for the universities, because if this explodes the way it did a year and a half ago on campuses, they're going to have a major problem with the Trump administration. It's not the Biden administration anymore. And so I think that's going to be a huge clash, and how the universities react is going to be very interesting.
Well, what's your sense? I mean, it certainly seemed, with Columbia waving the white flag, Harvard thinking about it, so they're sort of dithering as to whether they're going to, be the resistance or, do the sensible thing and not lose their funding. It seemed as if the fear of God had been put into college bureaucrats. They didn't want to be called before Congress and, be made, the butt of this, basically turned into jokes and largely losing their jobs, so that there were some instances of cracking down. Students were suspended, some were arrested. But if we're going to have another tsunami of, encampments and, sort of mob events, are these the sort of people that have the backbone to push back against this and to stick to, basically, do this and we're throwing you all out? You got to wonder.
Well, I think whether they have the backbone or not, they're going to be forced to act, and they're going to be forced to, employ equal treatment. I mean, that's what I've always said, is these protesters don't want equal treatment. They want special treatment. They want to be able to disrupt the library. They want to set up blockades. They want to do things that nobody else is allowed to do. So I think the administrations are going to have a problem. I will say, kind of looking at the life history, now that we're approaching the second anniversary of October 7th, the life history of these protests is, I think the administrations were extremely complicit in them to start, extremely supportive of them to start. Faculty was extremely supportive of them to start. And that's
Indeed, faculty were deeply involved in them, weren't they?
Yeah. faculty at Cornell, faculty led a lot of these protests. Of course, when the trouble came, they, slithered into the background so they wouldn't get in trouble. But at Columbia, they formed a line to protect the students from the police. Faculty have been extremely complicit in this. I don't think we're going to see that phenomenon now. There's been too much of a pushback. There's been, too much of a crackdown. So I'm not sure how this is going to play out, other than I think the students are going to become even more unhinged. It's part of the popular culture now. The false claims of genocide, false claims of famine, fed by the UN, fed by the mainstream media, the pictures of infants with severe congenital defects being presented as starving due to famine. All of these things have contributed.
And when you point that out, you're accused of being the equivalent of a Holocaust denier.
That's right. You point it out and you provide the medical records and you provide the evidence, and they accuse you of being a denier. But I'm saying that the popular culture, the mainstream media, has turned so much into incitement against Israel, with the New York Times and all of them portraying things falsely, that I think it's going to feed the campuses. I think there's going to be some serious clashes. Now, how the administrations react, the first time they invade the libraries, students who do that need to suffer the consequences, same consequences that anybody else would suffer if they did that. And if that happens early in the semester and it happens right away and frequently, I think you will see a lot of this die down. But what you may also see is sporadic incidences of extreme violence. I would not be surprised at all, because you see it in the streets of New York City right now. You see that sort of violent fringe, and particularly for colleges that are in, urban environments where the activists have access to the campus. I think you'll see more of that. Obviously, I can't 100% predict what's going to happen, but what I'm seeing is that there's going to be even more aggressive protests. They may be isolated in the sense of, turning into violence, but I don't know that you're going to see the massive participation, because I don't think the schools are going to permit that.
Interesting. Well, I have always believed and have written that if you're going to be advocating for violence elsewhere, sooner or later, you're going to start advocating it and maybe even practicing it at home. That certainly happened in the 1960s with, sort of the radical left, where a portion of them did turn to terrorism, domestic terrorism that's kind of swept down the Orwellian, memory hole. I think it's a possibility now, if for no other reason, that as much as I think a lot of students, they don't want to get into trouble, with they don't want to be thrown out of school. There's bound to be a not insignificant percentage of these people who really are radicalized. And they've been radicalized not just by the activities of, sort of groups on campuses, whether it's Students for Justice of Palestine or somebody else. They've been radicalized by the media coverage of the war, the post-October 7th war, with this constant drumbeat about Israel committing genocide and Israel deliberately starving Palestinians. These blood libels are bound, as they always have, to lead to, a very violent reaction from a certain percentage of people.
Yeah, I think, and that's part of the point of them. I think that, the instigating trouble, so to speak, is part of the reason the rhetoric is so over the top. So I think absolutely we're going to see that. You can't predict those isolated instances. You can't predict where they're going to happen or who's going to do them, but we've seen many of them already, and I think that's going to happen. The one wild card here that I'm a little hard to assess is the decline in the troublemakers from abroad. Although there's a couple of high-profile cases, particularly at Columbia, where the government seems incapable of kicking these instigators out of the country, by and large, there has been a cutback on the foreign students who were instigating this. I know at Cornell, it was a foreign student who was behind much of what has happened. He was the leader of it on campus. He's now self-deported when ICE came after him. I think you'll see that. So that's the only thing that I'm thinking might lessen what happens on campuses, is that some number, and I don't have the exact number, but some number of the foreign instigators are no longer on campus and no longer in the United States. That might have a positive impact. But they are working themselves into a frenzy. And part of it is frustration. I think they really believe their own BS. They really believe that, shutting down the library or setting up a checkpoint on campus is going to somehow, quote, free Palestine. And they're waking up to the reality, which is that the Israelis are not playing their game. The Israelis are not going to commit societal suicide just so, a dance major at Columbia can feel good about herself. They're not going to do that. And I think they're coming up against the real world. And in the real world, Israel is not giving up. Israel is not backing down. And they're not used to that. They're not used to people saying no to them. They're not used to people standing up to them. And so there's a frustration you can feel mounting that they've been protesting now for 2 years. And it really hasn't accomplished anything. There's no accomplishment they can point to. Hamas, while it's not totally defeated, is in much worse shape than it was when these protests on U.S. campuses started. They don't have an impact in the real world, because in the real world, Israel is not going to allow another October 7th to happen again. And these people on campus need to get that through their heads. They can protest all they want, but they're actually not going to change anything.
Well, I certainly hope Israel is going to be as tough as you're predicting. We'll see what happens. But that is a real, the disconnect between the outcome of sort of the fighting on the ground and the information war, which I think we have to acknowledge that to a large extent Hamas has won through its ability to sort of mainstream, its propaganda and get it into, the legacy media as the truth when it's anything but. That is, they look, certainly the enemies of Israel look at what's happened on college campuses, and they see this as, whether kids get thrown out or not, they don't care about them. They see that the anti-Israel agitation and the mainstreaming of it is, sort of a long-term victory for them.
Well, that's always been the fight. I mean, that's the whole point between the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. A lot of people think it's about boycotting products. It's not. If you listen to what they say, and you and I have both been covering that movement for 15 plus years, really, since its start. And they always used to say, BDS is just a tactic. And it took me a few years to understand what they meant. They actually don't care about boycotting products. What they want is they want the campus to spend 6 months debating how bad Israel is. Okay, and that's essentially what's happened. So you have to say that, well, BDS has been a complete economic failure. It's been a partial political failure. It has been a cultural success so far. They have very methodically co-opted every left of center movement. Black Lives Matter, the original protests in Ferguson, which launched the Black Lives Matter organization in 2014, were infiltrated by anti-Israel activists, and they turned it into anti-Israel protests. The BLM movement was, in its origins, infiltrated by anti-Israel activists. And so now the single greatest impactful movement, at least in this century in the United States, from its inception, was an anti-Israel movement. And they have been very smart about that. I have to say, they've been a lot smarter than everybody else. And there's a lot of fault on our side from progressives in the Jewish community who didn't want to recognize that, didn't want to admit that. That's a whole other discussion. But that they have been very good. And there is a cultural war, an information war, which people need to admit that people who now identify as Palestinians are winning. And they're doing it because they have massive backing that Jews around the world don't have. When you've got a Muslim population in the world of almost 2 billion people, a majority of whom want all Jews dead, okay, by every reliable survey. And then you got 20 million Jews, and then you've got an internet where numbers matter on X and elsewhere. Why is it all these lunatics spewing complete fabrications about Israel get so many followers and get such engagement? Because it's a numbers game. And unfortunately, the people who distort the truth, the people who lie about Israel have numbers. So it's a new challenge that we're facing. And it is, of course, playing itself out on the campuses because the kids get their news from TikTok and to a lesser extent, Instagram and whoever knows whatever other app they're using now. They don't get it from Facebook because kids are not on Facebook. That's something I've learned. Facebook is really a Gen X and boomer sort of thing. But, the other apps and the other platforms are much younger people, and they're getting fed a constant stream of lies, a constant stream of propaganda that they believe to be true. So it's a major problem, and it's definitely impacting the campuses.
Yeah. Now, Trump's prioritization of the cause of fighting anti-Semitism and DEI in higher education has transformed the debate about the issue. But the question now is whether the deal he brokered with Columbia, and perhaps the one to come with Harvard if that happens, and with others likely to follow, actually work. Are the safeguards in these agreements enough to ensure that the left-wing establishment that runs academia can't just wait him out or rely on liberal court rulings to go back to sort of woke business as usual?
Well, I think that what is happening, as you indicate, is they're waiting Trump out. They assume this is going to be, a one-term president, and they assume that Democrats will take over the White House again and the House, and that everything will be back to the pre-existing normal. And I can't say that they're wrong. And I've been preaching really since day one of this administration is that if the push against DEI and the push against anti-Semitism on campuses is just a 2 to 3 year phenomenon, it will come roaring back at the end of that. And so what I'm looking for with the agreements the administration is striking, and I think Columbia was a good agreement, but it fell short of permanency. It's a 3-year agreement. What happens after that? It fell short of making some of the structural changes that might be permanent, such as in hiring and things like that. They left the issue of faculty hiring out of the agreement. In fact, the agreement says it's not part of the agreement. But unless you change the faculty, unless you introduce some more balance, unless you make the faculties look like America, we always hear that Harvard and Cornell and the rest of the academia says, we need things to look like America. None of these schools look like America in their faculties. At Harvard, according to the Harvard Crimson, only 3% of the faculty identify as conservative or very conservative, compared to 37 or 38% in other surveys of the general population. 75 to 80% identify as liberal or very liberal, compared to about 27, 28%. I think that's Gallup polling or another reputable organization. So, and nothing that I saw in the Columbia Agreement changes the trajectory of the faculty. And unless you change the faculty, nothing will change. They're just hanging on. The analogy I like to use is they're like people clinging to a lifeboat in the water. Okay, their ship has just been sunk, and they're holding on, waiting for help to arrive. And they're not going to change their ways because they believe that help will arrive in 3 years in the next presidential election. And that's why, people need to be focusing on permanent change, on changes to the faculty, things that can't be undone. And I'm not criticizing the Trump administration. I think they're doing the best they can with difficult circumstances. But I think in the new agreements they come up with, they need to look at the structural changes that will not be as easy to undo if the administration changes in 3 years.
Yeah, and I think just to drill down a little bit further on this question, the question that comes to my mind is, can any of this work without a really consistent enforcement mechanism? And can that happen without a Department of Education? It is the most useless of government departments as a general rule, as I think the efforts to use it to enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to stop anti-Semitism improved. I think that whole game of, complaining to the Department of Education and creating negotiations and investigations, it's a dead end. I don't think it works. I think it's been tried, it's failed. But, and honestly, I understand, why Trump promised to get rid of the Department of Education and why there's support for that. But without an agency tasked with enforcing Trump's deals or the law, Won't its elimination help the woke left outlast Trump?
Yeah, and that's an important point, and I hope people in the administration are listening, okay, that they're doing two things that are at odds with each other, okay? On the one hand, they have a very worthy goal of getting DEI in its various forms out of education. But at the same time, they are eliminating the sub-agency, Office for Civil Rights. They've severely clamped down on staffing there, which is really the only agency in government that was doing something. Wasn't perfect, but as you know, I run what's called the Equal Protection Project, which is equalprotect.org. We've challenged hundreds of programs through the Department of Education OCR office. And we've had fairly good success. Even under Biden, they were relatively straight shooters. I wouldn't say they were straight shooters, but they were relatively serious about it. They lost half their staff in the middle of March. In the middle of March, Office for Civil Rights lost literally half their staff. And the people who are there now are very well-intentioned. They just don't have the personnel. So on the one hand, Trump is signing executive orders to get DEI out of education. On the other hand, they've reduced the staffing at the one sub-agency that was actually equipped to do that. And I hope, and there's a lot of rumors, and I have no inside knowledge, that if they do away with the Department of Education, that Office for Civil Rights function will find another home in the federal government, because they cannot get DEI out of education merely by the Department of Justice bringing lawsuits. That there aren't enough people there. You need to empower groups like mine and individuals to have a complaint mechanism, and you need to have a staff to handle that. So I would strongly urge the administration, depending what its plans are, to build up the OCR function, or if you're going to shut down the Department of Education, transfer it to another department. I'm not sure that's ideal, but that is a super important function. We have gotten real results. Hundreds of programs, discriminatory programs, have changed their eligibility standards because of what we did. Of course, you never know what's going on behind closed doors. There's no way to know that. But at least they're not advertising scholarships that restrict student participation based on race. So if you're listening, Trump administration, don't abandon the OCR function. It has been extremely effective. It could be even more effective under this new administration, but you need a mechanism to enforce your policies.
Can it be folded into the Department of Justice? Because they're really related. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, obviously, that's the sword that the government has and can use and has in the past used to promote, its agenda. Is that a possibility, or are they kind of apples and oranges?
Well, I think there's probably two issues there. One's from a statutory point of view. What is the jurisdiction over education of the Department of Justice? My guess is, and I haven't looked at this specifically, is that they would have jurisdiction over it. It's still civil rights violations. I think this could be folded into the Department of Justice. Whether administratively that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. My feeling is that as long as the Department of Education exists, and you have an Office for Civil Rights devoted to education, that's probably better. Because remember, under Harmeet Dillon, they're looking at a million different things. It's not just education. They're looking at voting rights. They're looking at, hiring practices. They're looking at affirmative action issues. They're looking at a whole host of things. But having a Department of Education, which is specifically focused on education, I think is a good thing. But it would be better to fold it into Department of Justice than to disband it entirely.
Or the Department of Interior,
or the Department of, or HHS. I think the administration needs to look at this, because they are intent on shutting down the Department of Education. But whether they can do that in totality is a question without legislation. But they can still invest the resources in the enforcement mechanism, which is OCR, even while the rest of the department is shrinking.
Now, my next question is something you've already alluded to, but how are the organizations that are promoting the campaign against Israel reacting to the Trump effort? What is up the sleeve of the Students for Justice in Palestine and all of the various Soros Foundation funded groups that have helped promote the anti-Israel surge. Where are they going with this? They have plenty of money. Some of it comes from abroad. We've heard about that. They're not going to take it lying down since they feel they've got the wind at their backs with the mainstreaming of all these blood libels against Israel. Are there new tactics? Or, we've already seen the encampments, the demonstrations, the library takeovers. There's only so far they can go with that. Is there something else that they're thinking of doing that you were aware of that could make it even tougher on Jewish kids going forward in the school year that's just beginning?
Well, part of it is the lawfare that's been going on, that they're trying to stymie these reforms, stymie various
So they've been playing
anti-DEI
defense,
efforts.
to Trump's offense.
Yes. Yep. And part of it is continuing their institutional capture. The American Association of University Professors is now run by an anti-Zionist professor from Rutgers. He's the president. They abandoned their opposition to systematic academic boycotts under pressure from the anti-Israel activists. And that was really one of the main defenses that Jewish students and Israelis had on campuses, was that the AAUP, the gold standard of determining academic freedom, had a position against what's called systematic academic boycotts, and such as the BDS. And that was abandoned, I want to say about a year ago. It could be 2 years ago, but that was abandoned under this new president. So they have weaponized the AAUP to prevent Jewish students from asserting their rights on campuses. The AAUP is now a weaponized anti-Israel organization, but it still has the patina of legitimacy. It's much like Amnesty International. We all know how corrupt Amnesty International is when it comes to Israel. The AAUP is the same way when it comes to Israel and Zionism and these campus protests. And so that's another thing they're doing, is they're continuing their march through institutions, and the faculty associations I expect to be even more vitriolic. Most of their annual meetings, I believe, come up in the fall and over the winter, and that's when you get these anti-Israel resolutions. So I would expect to see more vitriol from the faculty organizations, the national faculty organizations. And so that's what they're doing to weaponize it. But again, they have limited ability to influence things, but it's that constant drumbeat of raising public opinion against Israel that I think is where they're most effective.
Now, Jewish groups have been divided about Trump's efforts to defund anti-Semitic schools because, on the one hand, a lot of their donors just hate Trump and they don't want to be identified with Trump. And they also don't want to be linked to the effort to ban DEI because, their priority of groups like, ADL has been to be, remain in sync with their old liberal allies. And indeed, the ADL, the Jewish Federations, the Conference of Presidents, and Hillel all signed, a statement that came out last week that talked about all the things they wanted to see done on college campuses in the coming year, but, specifically left out the effort to get rid of DEI. But the question is, can anti-Semitism be linked without also banning the DEI policies that put it in place?
Yeah, well, you can't solve, a 1,000-year-old problem, okay, by getting rid of DEI, but you can lower its manifestations on campuses. You can get rid of the ideology which racializes everything, which puts Jews in the white oppressor category, and which encourages students to think of their lives based on identity group rather than individuals. And so it can be very helpful. And I've been a complete advocate. And I wrote an op-ed in the New York Post about a year ago, when the Cornell president quit, saying, that's nice that the Cornell president has quit, but until Cornell gets rid of DEI completely, it can never solve its problems. And that's my position now. I'm advocating it. I hope, again, if somebody from the administration is watching, I hope if you do strike a deal with Cornell, that you insist that they unwind this horrific July 2020 anti-racism program agenda campus-wide that the former president imposed on the campus. That's the first step. Getting the campus to focus on the inherent worth of every individual rather than identity group is the first step to curing the campus problem. It's not going to be enough in and of itself, but it would be a massive first step. And personally, I would rather see the administration force Cornell to unwind, as I said in my New York Post op-ed, to rip out by the roots the July 2020 anti-racism initiative, rip it out by the roots and all its manifestations, no matter how they've rebranded it as belonging and inclusion. Okay, they no longer use the term DEI. It's now belonging and inclusion. Go back, look at that July 2020 initiative that she imposed on the campus. Look at everything that's manifested from it. I've been at Cornell 18 years, and I can see in my observation a clear dividing line in the problems on the campus for Jewish students. And that dividing line was that July 2020 anti-racism initiative. And it needs to be gotten rid of. I'd rather see Cornell do that than have to pay $100 million to the federal government, where it will just get lost in the federal largesse. If the federal government wants to do true structural change to Cornell, it needs to get rid of DEI, particularly the DEI programming that started in July of 2020. Now, I don't think the school will do it. Again, I have no inside knowledge on that, but it's a religion to them. I believe Cornell would rather take a massive financial hit than give up their DEI programming. And that's something the Trump administration is going to need to face. Are they going to force these schools to truly and completely abandon this racialized view of education? Because if you don't get rid of that, if you allow that to linger in the background for 3 years, it's just going to come right back.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. And I think the question we need to address goes beyond Trump's current efforts. And, again, you've alluded to it. If these schools, can they really change if their faculties and administrators are all determined to preserve woke ideology and practices? And, obviously they're under fire. They're under siege by Trump. But is the existing system too far gone to save? I think that's the ultimate question we're going to have to ask. We may not know for a few more years. We have to see how this, 4 years of Trump 2.0 works out. But this gets back to a debate, we've had with those who want to create new institutions of higher learning because the old ones are just, can't be saved.
Yeah, it depends to some extent which side of the bed I wake up in the morning. Either it's completely hopeless and it's so far gone, we need to now figure out how we protect ourselves from the universities, not how we reform the universities. On the other hand, I guess, hope springs eternal. I do not believe that universities can reform themselves, at least not the so-called elite universities where we're having most of these problems. They're too far gone. When you have 97% of the faculty at Cornell who donate, of the ones who donate, 97% donate to Democrats, okay? It's too far gone. You cannot, for 20, 30 years, you cannot be hired in academia in the humanities and to a lesser extent, the social sciences if you're pro-Israel or identifiably conservative. It's too far gone. I frequently tweet on X that, these institutions are run by people more radical than you can ever imagine, and particularly in the humanities and social sciences, and they cannot be reformed internally. So I think the Trump administration, if it wants any positive change, is going to have to force it on the universities. They're going to have to accept these conditions, kicking and screaming in order to save their programs. But that needs to be done. If we can't reform them, how are we going to protect society from the universities?
Yeah, I think that's very true. If they're the threat, then, fining them or, sort of making some, marginal changes in them isn't going to make a difference. But of course, starting from scratch and creating, a whole new university system is an overwhelming task. I mean, there are some examples. They started, University of Texas in Austin that's one example of something good. There's another experiment at New College in Florida, but those are, there's Hillsdale, but, outside of that, these universities are sort of too big to fail. I'm very doubtful that we can save Columbia and Harvard and turn them around, but, where do you replace them? And of course, the question is, will sort of the market impact? Will people stop applying to Ivy League elite universities that have been totally captured by, the woke left and start going to, the schools in the Southeastern Football Conference, where these sorts of problems aren't as much of a problem? I mean, that's really the dilemma.
Yeah, and I think there's some evidence, there's certainly reporting on it. I don't know what the hard numbers are of students, particularly Jewish students from the Northeast, choosing to go south or the Midwest, where you don't have as many problems. How big a phenomenon that is, I don't know. But we should not underestimate the power of the credentialism that takes place. We should not underestimate how much parents are willing to spend and what they're willing to do in order for the kid to have an Ivy League degree. So I am not convinced that the Ivy League can be hurt very much, but we can create alternatives for people. And I do believe the brands have been hurt. There's no question. But that credential is still worth a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely true. Now, one other source of pressure on these schools has been from donors. We've had some examples of Jewish donors stopping their support of schools because of their tolerance for anti-Semitism. I think that happened at the University of Pennsylvania, where there really was an impact. But how wide-ranging is this trend? Is pushback from donors about woke influence increasing, or is this, a minor annoyance for them?
I think from the school's point of view, it's a minor annoyance. Again, I've always been amazed, and I'm sure there are psychological studies which have probably been conducted by the universities and exploited. How is it that you go to a school for 3 or 4 years when you're, 19 years old, and the rest of your life is now devoted to being associated with that school and supporting that school? What is it that connection that they are able to make? It's really hard to explain. I think there's some sort of psychological phenomenon, and I guarantee you the schools know exactly what they're doing. But how is it that you have 65-year-olds and 80-year-olds still wearing a Cornell hat, around town and coming back for reunions? What was it in that 3 or 4 years, a tiny portion of your life that you don't also have for high school? What is it? And I don't know that, but until that chain gets broken, I don't think the schools worry about it. For every, 7-figure donor who stops donating, there's another 7-figure lefty donor who steps up. I think Cornell, and I might be slightly wrong on the year, it was either 2023 or 2024, they had their best fundraising year ever. Okay.
Interesting.
So this is not impacting it. All the people, there may be some high profile people on the internet. I'm terminating my $10 million a year to Harvard.
Yeah. Bill Ackman, isn't giving to Harvard anymore, but
they do not.
How many others are there?
They do not care because there's another foreign or Middle Eastern or Chinese or lefty Soros type who's going to step right in. Now, the federal government funding is a lot harder to replace, okay? A lot harder because it's so enormous, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, if not more, at a place like Harvard. So that hurts the schools. But the loss of donors, I think the schools are laughing at it. I think behind closed doors, they couldn't give half a damn about it. Of course, they'd rather get the money than not get it, don't get me wrong, but they don't see it as an existential threat. And I think there's a lot of lobbying that goes on behind the scenes from development officers at major universities to major donors. I know, or I had reported to me, I've heard that some higher ups at Cornell went on a listening tour around the country to major donors. I think this was last year, maybe, when things were at the height of Cornell problems, that they they gathered conferences of major donors, and the provost and a few others would go to assure them that it's not as bad as the media is saying, et cetera. So these schools are very sophisticated. Nobody should misunderstand. These are major corporations whose business just so happens to be selling education. They wrap themselves in this flag of virtue, of this flag of, kindness, but they're not. They're just ruthless corporations like every other corporation who look out for their own self-interest, and their, marketing pitch is we're education, but they might as well be selling coal or electricity or something else. That's all they're about. And I think people don't realize that. They tend to think, in part because education has promoted it, that somehow they're better people because they run a higher education institution than the person who runs your local bank or the person who runs your local factory. That somehow the president of Cornell, and I'm speaking generically, not a specific person, that somehow the president of Cornell is more noble than the president of
some big pharma
pharmacy company. Okay, a big pharmacy company may save thousands of lives a year, but they're not Cornell. They're not educators. Okay, and it's a crock. So I think they view the donor issue at worst as a passing phase, and I'm not even sure they worry about it that much.
Interesting. Well, I would say that, just want to say as an aside, your question about why do people have such loyalty to schools, I think in part because most people go to high school because that's where, the high school is where they grew up, unless they were sent to some private school. They choose a college. And, the schools hold on to them. Sort of if you're in the Big Ten and the SEC, it's with sports. And in the Ivy League, it's with credentialism and the school tie. So I think that's how that works. Now, Trump has put the role, and we've already alluded to this, put the role of foreign students in funding at the center of the debate. But specifically, how important is Qatar's influence on our education system? Qatar is the largest foreign donor to American education. And what progress has, if any, been made in curbing the ability of foreign actors to promote toxic ideology in American education, especially when, even in the Trump administration, which has been so strong against anti-Semitism, they're also so soft on Qatar?
Qatar's a problem that nobody in the American political system seems to want to deal with. Okay, they fund think tanks. They fund a major international propaganda outlet called Al Jazeera. They manipulate our system. They created something called AJ Plus, Al Jazeera Plus, specifically targeting younger Americans with kind of woke, but very, sometimes not subtle, but very anti-Israel, anti-American sort of propaganda, but wrapped in a very sort of stylish way, a little less crude than some of the others, manipulating American youngsters. They know exactly what they're doing, okay? I don't know whether they're cutting checks to the so-called woke right or not. My guess is that's not how it works. They don't write a check to Tucker Carlson.
Well, we don't know that, but we'll get to Tucker in a moment. That's my next question for you.
The CEO of Tucker Carlson Productions, who's also the CEO of the Daily Caller, has gone on Twitter absolutely denying that they get any money or any funding from Qatar. And that might be true, but having Qatar on your side in this world is very helpful at getting business deals. The way they work, like many entities, is they don't cut you a check, but one of their agencies 3 steps removed throws you a business deal. Or their bot farms help promote you on social media.
Or they buy a property that some, a major developer in New York has had trouble selling.
That's right, who then ends up running
and
part of
the next thing you know, that's Steve Witkoff, and he's, negotiating with them.
The irony of Qatar, this, Muslim Brotherhood, basically conservative Islamic government, which actually is an apartheid state, okay? Unlike Israel. Running an entity called AJ Plus, selling woke anti-Israel and anti-Americans, videos to American youth. Okay, that's how conniving they are. They are a major problem. And like you said, they do business deals. You know, it's a population of citizens of 300,000 to 400,000 people are citizens. I think the population of the state is 2 or 3 million. I could be off on that number, but I think it's 2 to 3 million, most of whom are the equivalent of indentured servants or indentured slaves, and will never become citizens. That's true apartheid in Qatar. But anyway, getting back to your issue, what's their influence on education? They would simply say, oh, we have no influence. We just happen to donate billions of dollars a year. Well, they would be the only donor to education who donates that level of money and doesn't have influence. Of course, you know, if people used to complain about, you know, the Koch brothers, or people complain about Soros. Of course, we understand when they're donating money and endowing faculty fellowships or, you know, chairs, when they're creating institutes, of course they have influence. And I think that influence has been very malign on the campuses. But that doesn't mean there's a memo from someone in Qatar to a senior administrator at Georgetown saying, we want you to do this or we want you to do that. That's just not the way the world works. But money talks. And Qatar has established strong institutional funding relationships with many major schools. And we're supposed to suspend everything else we believe about politics to believe that that doesn't have any influence whatsoever. I don't believe it one bit.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's really a very toxic influence. But let's get to the thing we just alluded to, and it's another troubling element has been the rise of what, for lack of a better term, we've been calling the woke right, in which anti-Semitism has been promoted by conservatives and people on the far right, such as Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. What impact are they having on college campuses? We think of them as sort of just an internet phenomenon and sort of the debate on the right, but are they influencing education in any way?
Well, I think that's one thing that's going to be very interesting to see, because I would say this past 6 months is really when what's called the woke right has taken off. The vitriol, Tucker Carlson platforming and promoting Nazi historical revisionists, promoting priests, Palestinian priests and priests from the area, blaming the Jews for the depopulation of Christians in the Muslim world, when Israel is the one place Christians are doing well. A really noxious sort of obsession with Israel that a lot of people are noticing and mocking now. And that is having an impact on younger people in, let's call it the right, the conservative movement. Tucker Carlson spoke at Turning Point USA. Charlie Kirk has been generally very good on Israel-related issues.
But he's still platforming not just Tucker Carlson, but other people who are really terrible.
They get these speaking slots. Even though they have massive platforms, it's not like nobody can hear them. But when you put somebody up on stage at your convention, you're essentially endorsing them, and so there is some evidence that among some parts of the right, that anti-Israel phenomenon that we've seen in the left for 2 decades is making inroads. I don't know how you quantify it. They're puffing about it, saying there's no conservative student under 30 who doesn't hate Israel anymore. I don't believe that's true, but I do believe they have made inroads. And this is extremely, extremely strategic. And I would not be shocked if this is a Qatari move, that you look at the American landscape and how are you going to turn the United States, which really is all that stands between Israel and the abyss, as good as Israel is at defending itself, if it were to lose support from the U.S., it would be extremely difficult, That's something Israelis need to address moving forward, but it would be extremely difficult. And so they look at the U.S. landscape, and they've already got the Democrats. They've already got the left. They've spent the last 20 years cultivating the left, But the left has decreasing power in our society. They don't control any aspect of the federal government currently. And even on the left, kind of the, boomer Gen X generation left isn't as terrible as the younger, the AOC generation. So there's nothing more they can really do on the left. They have the left in the U.S., but they don't have the right. And so now they're making, I believe, a very deliberate attempt to defeat and damage Israel's standing among younger people on the right. They're playing a very long-term game. They're looking at where are things going to be 10 years from now? Where are they going to be 20 years from now? Just like the BDS movement. They knew they wouldn't make these accomplishments overnight, but they were looking 20 years down the road. And I think the game that's being played is to erode support for Israel in the Republican Party and among conservatives, including evangelical conservatives, to damage the U.S.'s support for Israel. I think that's the game. Now, is that going to work on the campuses? I think it remains to be seen. Will we see the so-called woke right joining with the woke left in protesting Israel? I don't know. Will we see groups on campuses inviting?
Certainly on elite universities, there aren't that many people who are on the woke right or on the right at all.
Statistically, it's not that much, but it's still the leadership of groups. And typically, and I've seen this at Cornell and elsewhere, it's the right-leaning groups that have always supported Israel. Doesn't mean they're Jewish, okay? And doesn't mean they're ideologically woke right or, pro-Nazi revisionism, okay? But that's where the support for Israel has always come on the campuses. And is that support from the conservative groups on campus going to diminish because Tucker Carlson has convinced them that Jews are the enemies of Christians and that, we need to cut Israel down to size? Is Marjorie Taylor Greene with her America only. She's now not America first. She's now America only rhetoric, which is always focused on Israel. Is that going to make inroads? I don't know. I think that's something I'm going to be watching this coming year, whether that's really is a social media platform issue or whether it's going to show up on the campuses.
Yeah, I think that's something we need to monitor, and we can expect it to be felt throughout society, but on campuses in the coming year too. My next question is, have Jewish organizations been effectively combating the surge in anti-Semitism? Certainly there's been some lip service, but as we saw, as I already noted last week, there was a statement that just was really clueless about what needs to be done. What do you think the specific Jewish response to this, crisis has been, and can it make this academic year different?
Well, the immediate reaction was really trying to put a Band-Aid on the wound. Okay, and a lot of the litigation that was commenced, things like that, are what I consider Band-Aids. And now Band-Aids are important. Okay, you need to stop the bleeding. Okay, so a lot of the efforts that have been taking place so far were aimed at stopping the bleeding as opposed to stopping the cause, addressing the underlying ideologies on campus. Yes, I think the lawsuits have had a prophylactic impact. I think they have scared administrations into action. They have spurred some action. It's all good. I'm not criticizing them, but it doesn't get to the problem. And the problem is not, frankly, just the library being disrupted or, someone's mezuzah being torn down, which I'm not minimizing that, but that's not really the problem. Is we have campuses which have adopted a decolonization narrative that leaves Jews as the perpetrators and as opposed to the victims.
The white oppressors, yeah.
The white oppressors. And that is extremely powerful. Decolonization, even though I make the argument that actually the creation of Israel was the single greatest decolonizational success story in modern history, that's not how they look at it. It's all racial. It's all racialized. It's all skin color. That's why this DEI is so pernicious. You